Hello and welcome to this webinar entitled GDPR, Myths and Misunderstandings, Unlocking the Confusion, with me, Keith Markham. As always, let's begin by having a look at the agenda, which is quite nice and wide-ranging for this session today. We'll begin by looking at the applicable rules, and there is a degree of confusion, certainly among people of my acquaintance, as to what the rules currently are, and in fact, that's particularly made more difficult by the fact that we obviously have the UK GDPR and also the EU GDPR. So we'll begin by looking at which of those is likely to apply to you and also looking at some of the differences between them, such as they are. Then we'll move on from there and talk about the issue of representatives. Again, if you are UK-based and you are dealing within the European Economic Area with data subjects and so on, essentially there's some confusion about whether you need to appoint a representative and how that works. Also, there's another issue with regard to that we'll discuss, which is if you accept the position of representative for somebody else, and they then are in breach, what happens to you? Are you responsible for what your principal has done? We'll look at those issues. Then we'll move on to look at lawful bases, and in particular, there is still a degree of confusion about relying on consent or relying on legitimate interests and which of those is appropriate, particularly when it comes to things like direct marketing. And we will look at that issue in the context of direct marketing and discuss what would be appropriate, how you can use that most effectively. Then we'll look at international data transfers. At the date of recording, we are fast approaching a kind of final cut-off date for UK-based organisations to adopt something called the International Data Transfer Agreement, or alternatively, they can use the European Union Standard Contractual Clauses with an addendum. And we'll look briefly at what those two approaches are and what that cut-off date is, and one or two other related matters as well in that particular sphere. Then we'll move on to personal data breaches, and the two big questions here are, do I need to report every breach? And also, do I need to record every breach? And we'll be looking at those two issues with some specific comment. Then we'll look at the issue of compensation, and we'll ask ourselves another question, which is basically, or two, in what circumstances will it be payable, and how much am I likely to have to pay if I'm a controller? And finally, we'll look at the outstanding bill, which again, at the date of this particular recording, has not yet been finalised. I will talk about the likely content and give you one or two pointers in terms of changes that you potentially will need to make.